Lexington, Kentucky, 1 p.m. on a Friday, Labor Day weekend. Diana, a medical flight nurse, was sitting in a Lear jet. The pilot was unconscious. The co-pilot could not move because he had a broken back. Diana's patient had died on impact. The plane was sitting on Versailles Road in Lexington after it had just slid across the road on its belly. The landing gear was gone. The right wing had been ripped off the plane. And now that it had come to a stop, Diana knew she had to get the door open and get people out because she could hear the crackling of fire and the cabin was filling with smoke. Except she couldn't stand up because she had a broken back and 2 broken legs. This is a flashback episode. Diana told this story on the podcast more than 5 years ago. So after you hear her amazing story, I'll play a recent conversation we had so you can see what's happened with her since then. Real people in unreal situations.
The eerie silence when I walked in, and he's just staring at me.
I was like, hello, like, are you okay? And then I had to tell him it was me.
There was just blood everywhere.
They're shouting, they're screaming, they're being hit by bullets, they're hitting the ground.
And in that moment, I literally thought, this is how I die.
Everything changed then.
And I just thought to myself, this isn't happening.
Every single story deserves to be heard.
I'm Scott Johnson, and this is What Was That Like? Have you ever been on a plane talking to a fellow passenger and told them this story?
Yes, actually, I have several times.
Really?
Yes.
So you're not worried that it might freak them out or something about flying?
That has been a concern of mine, but it has not. Actually, I think it allayed a couple fears, especially for one specific passenger when we were having some turbulence.
I'm just picturing, somebody sitting next to you that's kind of scared of flying and you're saying, hey, let me tell you this story.
Yeah.
Back when this happened, your job title, was it medical flight nurse?
I was the chief flight nurse for a nationally accredited critical care air ambulance called CareFlight.
And what was a typical day like, or what did you do in that capacity?
Well, we did fixed wing transports. So we flew Learjets, and we actually flew domestically as well as internationally. So a large majority of what I did was anytime a call would come in for a transport, I would make contact with the facility, the hospital where the patient was, to get a complete assessment report on the patient so that I knew what we needed as far as equipment, what we needed as far as medical staff. And then I did a large majority of the transports. So maybe I would do 3 or 4 flights in a week, 1 week and maybe 2 the next. It just depended.
Now, this accident happened in Lexington, Kentucky, but you didn't live in Lexington at the time, right?
No, that's correct. I live in Largo, Florida, and did at that time. And our main base was in Clearwater, at the St. Pete Clearwater Airport.
So you would always fly out of Clearwater then?
Right.
Okay. Were you always on the same plane or the same type of plane?
Well, we had a fixed wing. We had a 414, which was a twin engine, and then we had Learjets. And we had at one time six aircraft on our 135 certificate. But after 9/11, aviation took a huge hit. And right before this crash happened, we actually were on another company's 135 certificate, which meant that company maintained the jets. They provided the jets. They provided the pilots.
So the plane that you were on that day was a Learjet, right?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Can you describe kind of the layout of the plane, who was on it, where they were for this particular flight?
Yes. So it was a Lear 35 So you have a small cockpit in the front with the captain in the left side and the co-pilot on the right side. And then right behind that was a jump seat. And then along the right side of the aircraft was a stretcher equipped with oxygen and all kinds of monitoring equipment. And then a back bench seat, which is where I sat 90% of the time. And then 2 captain's chairs, sort of like on the left side for family members or a extra crew member. Ironically, this specific day, I did not sit in the back of the aircraft because when I picked up the patient, she told me she did not want to lie down. She wanted to sit up. And that was part of the miracle, because if I would have been sitting in the back of the aircraft where I did 90% of the time, I would not have made it because it cracked and burned all the way through that part of the aircraft.
So we've got a total of 5 people on the plane. You've got the pilot and the co-pilot in the front, and you and the patient kind of in the middle.
Right. I was sitting right behind my co-pilot, and she was sitting right in front of me by the door, and her husband was directly behind her, who, by the way, flew P-51 Mustangs in World War II.
Wow. Can you tell us anything about the patient, what the situation was, or if is that a medical privacy thing?
Well, I won't. I would just let you know this, that I had called the day before, and they had just wanted to use our aircraft and oxygen. This was a elderly woman who had end-stage lung cancer, and they lived part-time in Marco Island and part-time in Lexington. So they wanted to go from Marco back to Lexington so that she could see her specialist there. But because we were an accredited air ambulance, we had to follow certain guidelines. She had signed a do not resuscitate. So I went without my partner, without my flight partner, and I brought oxygen and all the other things that we normally bring on a transport, but we tried to make it as non-medical as possible per her request, meaning she got to sit up. She didn't lie on the stretcher. We kept everything very low key so that she could feel comfortable.
So the general flight that day was you flew out of Clearwater, which is the Tampa Bay area, to Marco Island where they were, and then up to Lexington.
Right. So when we landed in Marco, which is only a 6,000-foot runway, we touched down. No problems. We stopped and we picked up the patient. And then when we landed in Lexington, that's a 7,500-foot airstrip. And then that's where things went horribly wrong.
Let's start from that point. You're approaching Lexington and going in for the landing. Can you just take us kind of a minute-by-minute narrative of what happened?
Certainly. About 20 minutes prior, we start our descent from about 41,000 feet. So the captain lets me know that we are starting our descent, and we call ahead to the FBO there to make sure that they know we're bringing in a patient. And then I secure the cabin. I made sure that the patient was secure, her husband was secure, all medical equipment was secure, and that I was secure. So it was a beautiful sunny day. Nothing seemed amiss. We touched down. And when you touch down, you're doing about 200, 250 miles per hour. And immediately the brakes would come on a normal flight. But we weren't slowing down. And I immediately realized something was wrong. Now, I could see where I was sitting. I was looking, if I looked forward to my right, I could see my captain. And I heard him saying, no brakes, brake me. So at that point, then my co-pilot would be trying to stand up on the brakes. And he said, no brakes. I didn't panic at that point because I know we have a reverse thruster. It's a backup system where when they pull back on the thrust from the engines, the thrust would would reverse and would actually could stop you on a dime. And when I watched him do that, nothing happened. And now my anxiety was rising as I heard my pilot scream, hold on, hold on. And what they could see that I could not see at the end of this runway, unlike most runways have grass or maybe gravel or even water. This one had a 60-foot cliff. So we were going off the end of the cliff. I just kind of tucked my tailbone down and pulled my knees up and just braced. And I screamed, hold on. And so my patient and her husband, there was nothing anybody could do. We just tried to hold on.
Were all of you seat belted in?
Yes, absolutely. Seat belted in. And all the equipment was seat belted in. But the crash was so severe, it tore the plane to bits. You know, we were all still in our seats at the end of the crash, but things inside the aircraft had gotten totally torn away. If she would have been on the stretcher, it probably would have killed me because the stretcher actually kind of came forward and hit me.
This is Scott. What you'll hear next is the last couple of minutes of audio for this flight from the cockpit voice recorder.
And gear down before landing check there. Gear's coming down. Three green, no red. Engine sync is off. Anti-skid. Okay. Landing and taxi lights are on. Air ignitions are coming on. Flaps are set 10. Hydraulic pressure is good. 20 flaps. Flaps coming 20. Autopilot's off. Yaw dampener and full flaps will complete the list. You look at the thrust reversers. Arming 1 and 2. Runway is clear. Rapid 20, holding steady. And full flaps. Full flaps? Yep. Yaw dampener will complete the list. Rapid 15, holding steady. Short final, 3 green, no red, flaps are set full. Reppin 10. On ref. They're not deployed, are armed only. Lock. Lock. Break me. We're not going to break. We're not going to break. Lock, we're going off the end. Okay. Hold on.
When I realized we were going off the end of the runway, the captain and the pilot and the co-pilot would later tell me there was no control over this aircraft. So our nose was pitching right into the ditch. There was about a 15-foot ditch as we came off the end of the runway. We're heading into the ditch. And as we come off that runway, there was a huge wooden ILS structure for instrument approach. And our right wing crashed into this because I remember smashing my head into the wooden partition between myself and my co-pilot on that impact. But at that point, that tore our right wing away from the aircraft. So half of the fuel was torn away from this aircraft. And then we hit the highway and it sheared off our gear and we went across 6 lanes of this highway. And at this point, we were on fire. Amazingly, this is a 6-lane thoroughfare through Lexington, Kentucky, and it's 1:00 on Friday before Labor Day, and there were no cars that got hit. There were cars everywhere, but there were 2 red lights that happened to be red at this exact time, and we slid across the 6 lanes of highway, and just this screeching metal and smelling smoke and feeling disoriented, and then we came to an abrupt stop.
When you were going across that road, it was just sliding on the belly of the plane. The wheels weren't engaged anymore.
Correct. It was just metal on concrete. A horrific sound.
Oh, I'll bet. But let me take you back to where you went over the 60-foot drop.
Yes.
When you looked forward, could you see that drop coming?
No.
So you didn't know you were going to drop.
I did not. They could see it. I was looking at a door that has the gear to open it, so there's no window in that door. And I could look forward and see my pilot, but I couldn't see the front cockpit glass.
So, I mean, it's bad enough if you can see that you're going to drop, but if all of a sudden you get that sensation of falling, I mean, that's like going off the top of a 6-story building.
Right. And when we hit down, I felt intense pain in my legs and in my back. It did break my back. I had a fracture of a vertebrae, and the force of it was so great that my lower leg bones pushed up behind my upper leg bones. My tib fib went behind my femur and actually tore all the supporting ligaments of my knees. So I had no connection between my lower leg bones and my upper leg bone, the femur. And in the process of doing that, it ruptured the huge artery that runs to give you blood flow to your lower extremities, the popliteal artery. And so actually my toes were kind of turned opposite of my body, and I had no ability to stand or move my legs.
So you couldn't stand up. And when the plane came to a stop, what did you do at that point? Or what sounds were you hearing?
The sounds I was hearing the distinct crackling of fire. And I could smell the smoke, and the smoke was heavy inside the cockpit. And I heard moaning, and I looked forward, and I could see my captain, but he was unconscious, kind of draped over the yoke, and there was blood dripping from his head. And then I could see my patient, and she had just kind of collapsed forward and wasn't moving. And I could not see her husband, who was directly behind her. And the only reason I can think is maybe because of the smoke. I don't really know why I couldn't see him. But I had like the feeling of overwhelming terror just rise up inside of me. And I said, and we train for these kind of emergencies, you know? And so I said, okay, I have to respond. I have to get us out of this aircraft. And I had heard my co-pilot moaning. I said, Jim, are you there? Are you okay? And he's like, no. And he said, my back's broken. He could not move. So literally there was nobody else to do anything but me. And that's when I tried in all of my might to stand up, because all I had to do was stand up, lift the gear, and push the door open, and I would have been able to get out and start pulling people out. But again, because of those injuries I suffered with my legs, I tried 2 times to stand up, and I'm like, why can't I stand up? Thought it was my buckle. I checked my buckle again and tried with all my might to stand up and could not. And it was at that point I realized in my strength I could do nothing. And so I just started praying. I started crying out, dear God, in Jesus' name, please save us. Dear God, in Jesus' name, please save us. And my captain would later tell me that he felt somebody gently shaking him. Now, it wasn't me, and it wasn't my co-pilot. And he could hear me praying behind him. And he said that there was somebody saying, open the doors, Mile, open the door. And so he came back. Now, the smoke had to have been so thick because I never saw him. And he would have stood right in front of me, opened the door, and fell out. People from the cars that were nearby came, and one man had a fire extinguisher, and he was trying to suppress the flames. Well, that was kind of futile, but he did take the fire extinguisher, and he was smashing against the cockpit because they could not open the door of this aircraft. And the emergency door at the back was engulfed in flames. So the only escape out of this burning inferno was the front door right in front of me, and they could not open it from the outside. One man broke his hand in the process. Then Miles opened the door and fell out. And by this time, there was the crash fire rescue there at the airport, and they had to come out and around onto this Versailles Road, this 6-lane highway. But there was one firefighter who was in the truck that shoots foam, and he said he heard parallel the runway. So he got down to the end of the runway, right where the gate was, like right at the hill that we came off. And he was shooting foam across the 6 lanes of highway, trying to suppress the fire.
Does it even shoot that far?
It's amazing. I don't know how far it shoots. I mean, my husband's a firefighter, and he's like, die. It's amazing. The other amazing thing was that the wind direction changed within just a minute, because later on we would see security camera footage on the top of the runway there. There was a parking lot adjacent to it that had a shot like every 30 seconds. So when you saw us, there was a picture of the aircraft going off the end of the runway, and then you see a fireball, and the smoke is going from the front of the aircraft to the back. And in the next camera shot, it's like the wind did a 180, and the flames were going away from us. The smoke was going away from us. It was absolutely amazing. So they grabbed my patient, they pulled her out, and I think I was in and out of consciousness at this point. I do remember this man picking me up, and then I remember laying out there, and I looked over and I could see that my patient was unconscious, and I said, could somebody start CPR? And there was an off-duty nurse there, and she was valiantly trying, but it was to no avail. And then I was screaming for my co-pilot, get my co-pilot. He was trapped inside of that burning aircraft. They had gotten the patient out. They had gotten her husband out. Miles was out on his own strength, and then they pulled me out. And Jimmy is 6 foot, and he was about 280 pounds, just big guy.
And that's the pilot.
That would be the co-pilot. Miles
was
the
co-pilot. Okay.
Yeah, Miles was the captain, and he was the one that had the head injury, but was able to get out and open the door and get out. But he was very disoriented. He didn't know where he was. He couldn't tell them how many people are on board. Now my co-pilot, he's very conscious, looks back and realizes that the flames are coming forward, and he was also a firefighter, and he was like, "Oh my God, I'm gonna die in a fire in an airplane." But this man, right before the firefighters got there, there was an off-duty firefighter who worked at Lexington Airport as a security guard, and he was also a horse jockey. So this guy is only like 5'6", 140, 150 pounds, and a couple weeks prior, he had failed a strength agility test at the fire station. He gets in the aircraft. Carl is his name, and he put his arms around my co-pilot and lifted him out like he was a rag doll.
Adrenaline, it's a heck of a drug.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
You know what I'm picturing is these people that were at the red light in their car.
Oh my God.
You know, I mean, 1 minute they're just sitting at a red light on their way to work, or maybe leaving work to go for the long weekend. And the next minute, they're pulling people out of a burning plane.
Exactly. I can't imagine what they thought. And it was amazing to me how many people ran to a burning aircraft because, I mean, I don't understand why it didn't explode. And just the bravery to come to people's aid that they had no clue who we were. It was amazing. We did get to meet some of them. They had a reunion. They had a ceremony up there months later to thank all the policemen, the firefighters, and the civilians that came. And I was actually able to walk. I was still walking with a cane at that point. Came back up there to say thank you and hug people and have them retell what had happened, because, you know, so parts of my memory were just like little chunks. And I, you know, because of the trauma and the shock of it all, it was hard for me to put all the pieces together. And it was very helpful in my healing emotionally and spiritually to be able to talk with these people and just realize how miraculous this whole event was.
Oh, that had to be an incredible reunion. Yeah. So you got out of the plane, or everybody got out of the plane, and then what?
Right. So I remember lying there on this grassy knoll, and one woman was actually, she came and she was praying over me. I was coming in and out of consciousness, and I asked if I could use her phone, and she dialed the number for care flight, and I told the dispatcher what had happened, and I didn't at this point know that we had gone off a 60-foot cliff. I didn't know everybody's extent of injuries, and I told her, I think I've broken my legs. I just knew I couldn't move my legs. Then I asked this woman to call my husband, who was at the fire station, and he answered, and I told him, I said, baby, we went off the runway. There was an accident. I'm okay. I think I broke my legs. And then the woman took the phone because she could see that my toes were going opposite of my body and I was going in and out of consciousness. And she said, this is far worse than broken legs. And then she laid her body over me because that truck that was shooting the foam, she was shielding me from the foam getting all in my face. And then I heard the helicopter. I mean, it's amazing that we were in Lexington. Just the week prior, I had gone to the Dominican Republic, and there's nothing like that. There's no level 1 trauma center in the Dominican Republic. So if it would have happened there, it would have been a total different outcome. But the helicopter landed, and when you come up on a scene, you do triage. So you go and you look at the patient that has the highest degree of injuries, the most critically injured, but still has a chance to live. Obviously, my patient died on impact. Now they had gotten Jim out. We were all laying there, and I was telling them, my co-pilot, his back is broken, and they were taking me and putting me on the stretcher. They were putting me on the board, and I'm like, no. And then I started thinking to myself, my God, if I am worse than a broken back, this is not good.
Did you feel? You are a nurse. That's your job,
right?
Did you feel any obligation from a medical standpoint to help the others that were there?
Absolutely. Everything in my heart. I was, it was so difficult to see my patient lying there and I could do nothing. And knowing that my co-pilot's back was broken, and I had no idea the extent of the patient's husband's injuries. He was critically injured as well, just not as life-threatening as my injuries were. So he was taken by ambulance. My co-pilot was taken by ambulance. My captain was taken by ambulance, and I was flown in the helicopter. I remember looking up and seeing 2 flight personnel in the same color blue jumpsuit, flight suits that I use. And they were starting 2 large bore IVs, and I'm sitting, it was like an out of body experience. I'm like, no, that's what I do.
Yeah, it's a role reversal.
It was insane. I went immediately from being that critical care nurse to the critically injured patient, and I'm an in charge, take charge kind of person. And it was like, I can do nothing. It is all out of my scope of anything I can do. Remember being on the aircraft and I was in so much pain. And so they were giving me something for the pain. And it was not a long flight at all. I think it was less than 10 minutes till we touched down. And I was going in and out of consciousness because I was bleeding actually into my legs. I was hemorrhaging. It's called compartment syndrome because of those major arteries. I was actually bleeding down into the tissues around all my muscles in my lower legs. And I remember laying in the trauma bay and I could hear a nurse saying she has no pulses in her feet. And I'm thinking, oh, dear God. They thought I had femur fractures because of the deformity to my legs, but it was really that I had pulled away all those ligaments. That's what made the deformity. So my lower leg bones were turned around. But in that process, like I said, it had ruptured the arteries and I was bleeding down into my legs. And so I remember having intense pain, and they were doing, x-rays and starting IVs. And in the process of fracturing my back, I punctured a lung. So they were bringing all the equipment to put a chest tube in. And I have put chest tubes in my life to save people's lives. And I was like, I'm alert. You are not putting a chest tube into me while I'm alert. Just hang on. But I remember hearing my co-pilot, Jimmy, and he was actually in the trauma bay next to mine, and I could hear him, and I said, please, could somebody give him something for pain? Give him something for pain. The nurse that was taking care of me, her name was Lee, and the nurse that was taking care of Jimmy was Tammy. And Tammy came over to my nurse, Lee, at one point. There's got to be some comic relief, and I guess she had medicated me so I could hear, but my eyes were closed, and she said to my nurse, Whale, in her sweet Kentucky drawl, how's she doing? You think she's going to make it? And my nurse Lee said, damn, she's built like a brick shit house. I think she's going to be fine. I remember thinking, don't you know? Hearing's the last to go. Were you people talking about me?
Did you ever tell them that you could hear them, what they said?
Oh, yes. We're like best friends now. She laughed so hard. But this nurse, unbelievable, she went with me up into x-ray because they had to do an arteriogram where they inject dye to figure out where I was bleeding. And sure enough, it was bad. It was my popliteal arteries. And so they were going to have to send me to emergency surgery. And Lee stayed there with me. She held my hand. Now, she was the ER nurse. She didn't have to do that. She came up there with me. And at that time, I remember a phone ringing in the background. And my son, who was 18 at the time, he was dating a girl whose father was a fireman. And that sweet girl's now my daughter-in-law. But they got through to the trauma center and they actually put them up to, they put the call through. And so they said, my nurse Lee said, she needs to talk to her son before she goes anywhere. And I could hear my son. And he was just sobbing. He said, Mom, tell me you're going to be okay. And I said, baby, I love you. I'm going to be okay. And he said, Mom, listen. We've called the church and the prayer chain has started. So, when things happen, people call our church, then their deacons would be notified and then they would notify people under them. And it was like, telephone, one person calls the next person. So I felt this enormous peace that passes all understanding. And I had to sign a consent that said I was going into surgery and they were going to try to do what we call a femoral popliteal bypass, where they took a vein out of my leg to make a new detour around the broken arteries to restore circulation to my lower legs. But if that was not successful, they may have to amputate my legs. So that was really heavy having to sign that. And then I remember saying, could we pray? And there's people running around in surgical garb and everybody just freezes. Yes, yeah, we can pray. And then they're all looking at each other. You pray. No, you pray. I'm thinking, oh my God, not a Baptist in the bunch. Come on, somebody pray. But so I think I remember praying out loud, and then I think they gave me something, and then I was just probably praying in my mind. But I remember saying, God, you brought me this far, and I know that you are with me. And if it be your will, may I have my legs when I come out. And if not, God, then just give me the grace to handle it. And that was the last thing I remember. I was in surgery for 13 hours, and they had to replace my circulating blood volume. I had about 12 to 13 units of blood and plasma and clotting factors, and they almost lost me twice because of the extensive bleeding. Then I came out, and while this was going on, my company flew my husband up, and they flew Jim's wife up. And my husband said every hour on the hour, somebody from the OR would come out and give an update on Jim and myself. And after the 13 hours, they came out, and the vascular surgeon and the orthopedic surgeon were there. And the orthopedic surgeon told my husband, that's the worst injuries I've ever seen to somebody's knees. I doubt she'll ever walk again. She's got a broken back. We haven't even been able to address that. And then the vascular surgeon said, oh my word, her veins are bigger than most people's arteries. I was able to get a good bypass, and her toes are pink. I'm really happy with that. And so my husband just fell to his knees, and he thanked God that I was still there. And my pastor at the time, Dr. Scott Boggs, actually felt led, and he flew up, and he got that there not long after I got out of surgery. And a friend that I went to high school with had heard what had happened, and she actually lived in Lexington, and she had been taking chemo treatments for breast and lung cancer. And one of our other friends called her, and she actually showed up at the hospital and was there with my husband when he saw me for the first time. And she told me that he was telling, I was on a ventilator, and I don't remember any of this, obviously, but he was telling me, babe, I'm here, and the kids are on their way. And they just prayed over me. And then she took him outside, and my pastor told me he just prayed over me for a long period of time and just started praying the Psalms out loud over my body. And he said that my legs, they had to put these steel fixator rods. They drill them into your leg bones, and then they're connected, to a long steel rod on the outside. It's called external fixators. Because again, there was no connection between my upper and lower leg bones. All my ligaments were torn away. So they had to have a way to keep my legs intact. And there was bleeding that would not stop. And he said that they had to change the bandages like 2 or 3 times while he was there. And he felt like, he felt a peace come over him that I was going to make it. And he was able to go out, and he saw my son, and who was in the hallway, and he was just distraught, thinking that, I wasn't going to make it. And he told my son at that point, he said, Chad, your mom's going to make it. And not only is she's going to make it, she's going to dance at your wedding. And years later, he was there at my son's wedding to see me dance with my son, which I just think is a beautiful thing.
Unbelievable.
I was in ICU for a week, and I told you I had a punctured lung. They had me on a ventilator. And because of the smoke inhalation, I'm sure, and because of all the massive amounts of fluid, my lungs took a terrible injury. And I was in what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome. They had to have me on high levels of oxygen, high pressures. My muscles broke down because of the massive trauma. It's called rhabdomyolysis. And then as that circulates through your blood, it gets into your kidneys, and it clogged up my kidneys. I went into acute renal failure. My blood was having a hard time clotting, and I had excessive bleeding, which is called disseminated intravascular coagulation. And as a critical care nurse, I know that each one of those things has an 80% mortality. You put them together, it's called multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. It has a 95% mortality. I also, at one point, shot a temperature of 104, and they were afraid I was septic. And so what I'm saying is, I went against all odds because I should not be here. I should not be here.
13 hours of surgery. And you said that
Yes.
didn't even address your broken back.
It did not. They would later, after I finally got out of ICU, I was on a step down unit, and they thought that they might have to do some surgery to my back. And they wanted at that point to go back and open up my knees because all the ligaments were torn away. And all I could keep thinking was, I want to go home. I just want to go home. And my best friends had flown up, and I have a nurse and a respiratory therapist. And at one point, they were actually able to get me in a wheelchair with my legs extended on these ramps of the wheelchair so I could go see my co-pilot, who was paralyzed from his waist down. And one good thing about being a flight nurse was I knew where all the great trauma centers and rehab centers are. We've flown to most of them. So they were flying him to a Shepherd Spinal Institute in Atlanta. And he was there for months and months. And I just wanted to go home. So they got it together, and my medical director, Dr. Mike Mazzaferro, and Linda, my respiratory therapist, and Michael Lynn, another flight nurse, they flew up on another jet and they brought me home. And that was September 12th, 2003. And I was in a trauma center here at Bayfront. And the orthopedic surgeon came in and he said, Diane, I've never seen somebody with that injury live. He had taken care of a young man who jumped off the skyway and had those injuries. He didn't live. Anyway, he said that the force that ripped those ligaments apart was so intense that it took bone fragments. And he said, if we let you just let your body heal for a while and give you rehab, let's see how well your knees will do. Let's see if the ligaments will scar down, and then we'll reevaluate it. And the vascular surgeon was very pleased with my progress. Now, the one surgeon did note they had to do what we call fasciotomies to save my life up in Lexington, where they have to slice down both sides of your calves to allow the pressure to release. So I had like 4-inch deep gouges that were 8 inches long down both sides of my lower legs, called fasciotomies. And in doing so, they cut through one of the major nerves down there, your peroneal nerve. So my right foot was dropped. So nobody really thought I was going to be able to, regain a normal function. And so they wanted me to stay there at a rehab in place rehab. And I said, please, I just want to go home. So they arranged for me to come home. They got a hospital bed here. They had all the equipment they needed, and my family took care of me. And 3 times a week, this wheelchair van would pick me up and take me to an outpatient rehab facility where for 2 hours, 2 grueling hours, they would try to get function back into my knees and strength back into my muscles. And there was a pool there, and they would lower me down in this contraption, it was like a plastic chair, and they would slowly lower me into the water. And once I was in the water, you're buoyant. And so I didn't have to hold up all my own body weight. And I would slowly learn how to take steps again. But it was excruciating. It was not easy.
So this was the process that you were about to go through, to hopefully with the ideal end result being that you could walk again.
Exactly. And I remember saying to the orthopedic surgeon up in Lexington, I said, I said, how long will it be till I can, walk again? And I remember him saying, I don't know if you'll walk again. And I remember very clearly saying to him, I walk again. I'm going to go back to teaching aerobics. I want to run again. And I remember saying to him, looking at him and saying, you know what, you can doubt me, but don't you doubt the God that pulled me out of that burning aircraft when I called on his name. And if he says I walk, I walk. And if he says I run, I run. And I think that was such a challenge to me. And I've always been a person that likes to very athletic, and I rise to the occasion of a challenge. But this was by far the hardest thing I have ever had to do in my life.
Wow. And I can imagine from his standpoint, when you tell him that he's thinking, well, that's great. You can think that, but I know from a medical standpoint, it's not too likely. But
exactly.
So I understand why he would try to manage your expectations, of course.
Absolutely. I don't blame him one bit. In fact, I think that helped me. It inspired me. And it was great to go back there later and actually walk in with a cane and show him that I was able to walk. And he said, I love when patients prove me wrong.
Yeah. You started on quite a journey of getting back on your feet again. I
Yes.
saw in the video, and I'll post a link to this video so people can watch it, as you were starting to learn how to use your legs again, you had these rods that were embedded in the front of your legs from, the entire length of your leg.
Right.
And what was the purpose of them? What are they called? And what did they do?
Okay, so those are called external fixators. So because all those supporting ligaments in my knees were torn away, there was no way to hold the lower leg bones to the upper leg bones. So they drilled 2 holes in my femur and 2 holes in my lower leg bones, brought rods out, and then one long straight rod through all of them, kind of like an erector set.
That's exactly what I was thinking. You look like a walking erector set.
I tell you, they were very painful. Every time you move, the metal would just, rip your flesh from your bone out to your skin. I still have scars from where those were in my legs, but I tell you, they did what they were supposed to do, and for that, I'm grateful.
Those rods are what held the top part of your leg to the bottom part of your leg, and so they had to be there long enough for those 2 sections of leg to kind of grow back together?
For the ligaments to kind of heal down in order to give enough strength for me to stand again. I did have 4 more surgeries, and one of those surgeries was he had to give me a ligament from a bank, a cadaver ligament, and then he was able to use a thermal probe to kind of shrink. Your ligaments are kind of rubberish, if you will. And if you stretch them too far, then they're too lax and they're no good. But because the orthopedic surgeon here, Dr. Coco Eaton, was so amazing and gave me the time for it to heal, he only had to replace one of them, where prior to that, they wanted to replace all 4 in both knees. And he had to just kind of shrink down the other ones. And then one of the most difficult things was trying to get your knees to bend again. I mean, there was so much damage done to the knee itself. They told me I would probably have to have a couple knee replacements, and I haven't had 1 knee replacement. And I am running and biking, and
that's incredible.
It's amazing.
The knee itself is a very complex joint, and without any injury, just from wear and tear over time, people have to have them replaced. Right. But yeah, I was back to that video that I was watching. It shows like 1 minute you're creeping along or trying to walk, holding yourself up with your hands on the bars and learning to walk. And then in the video, it kind of flashes forward and you're instructing an aerobics class like nothing ever happened. How much time went by before that could happen?
It was over a year. Yeah, it was, I had the external fixes in for at least 8 weeks, and then it was rehab for over a year. And at one point, I convinced work comp that it would be cheaper for me to just go to one of the gyms that I taught at and work with a physical therapy assistant one-on-one than for them to keep paying for this rehab. So I actually was at the gym where I taught aerobics. And one day, and this was probably about a year after, somebody didn't show up to teach a step class. And I just smiled and I said, well, let me just see what I can do. And I remember putting the step on the floor and saying, ladies, if I have to stop, just keep going and I'll just talk you through it. Probably one of the best days of my life when I got to teach that class, sweat pouring off my body. And it was painful, but it was amazing because I realized that I had come so far. Like I had really done what in reality I shouldn't have been able to do. It was miraculous.
And I can imagine the ladies that were in that class, boy, not a one of them better complain about how much it hurt. Right.
Exactly. And you know what was cool was some of those ladies in that class and people from all over, they just stepped up to help us. There were several groups that put spaghetti dinners together to raise funds for my family. My best friend, Linda Turner, who worked with me as a critical care nurse years ago at a hospital. That hospital had a bake sale to raise money. The fire department, my husband worked at Pinellas Park Fire Department. The guys worked for him so that he could be at home with me. And our church, everybody just stepped up and really filled in the gap. It was so, I don't even know, there's not even a great word for it. It just blew our minds. We were just in awe of the outpouring of goodness from so many people.
Did you go back to being a flight nurse?
I did not. Unfortunately, it was at a time when the company ended up folding. And I think that this was the kind of the nail in the coffin. I did fly. I have flown since. I'm not afraid to fly, but it's wild. While this was going on, a physician that I ran into, a cardiologist, said, "Hey, Di, you really should think about going back and finishing your degree. You would be an awesome teacher." And so I applied for a scholarship and I got the scholarship. And at that time, while I was doing physical rehab, I was doing my bachelor's online at the very college where I had graduated, St. B College. And then I started working there part-time and went and finished my master's at University of Central Florida. And so for the last part of my career, for over 10 years, I was a professor of nursing, which I absolutely loved. And I just retired from full-time in December, and I'm still an adjunct and do some online teaching. And so I was able to use my years of experience and my education to now hopefully inspire and empower the next generation of nurses coming after us.
Do you have any lingering injuries? Any reminders of the crash?
I do. So my arteries, I've got great blood supply to my legs, but my veins were damaged. So if I stand for prolonged periods of time, I get what I like to call cankles, where your thighs look like your ankles or your ankles look like your thighs. I just get swollen down there, and that's painful. If I sit for any period of time, my knees get stiff, and on occasion my knee will kind of shift out of place, and that's painful.
When that happens, do you kind of just pop it back into place, or what do you do?
I stretch. Exactly. I stretch and move until I feel like it's back in where it needs to be. I get massage regularly. I have my chiropractor's my best friend, Dr. Steve Wyckoff. So yeah, and I never did have to have surgery on my back. Thank God. Lots of therapy, through massage, through chiropractics, through acupuncture, physical therapy. I really am back to where almost I have no lingering injuries from that. But another thing that is amazing when I really think about it, we talk about the gate theory of pain, where, you have the perception as it rises up to your brain, and then you feel it, and then you respond to it. And when I feel that pain, it's almost like I can go in mentally and say, I'm just going to choose to not focus on that pain, and I'll focus on something else. And then I don't feel it.
That is a great, that's a talent.
It's a gift. There's no other way to say it, because I'm not on any kind of medications.
How about the other people, the pilot, the co-pilot, the patient's husband? What has been their long-term outcome from this? Yes.
The patient's husband, when I got to see him, now again, this is 17 years ago, went out to lunch with him, and he had knee surgery, but he was mobile and getting around. And he told me that he was a P-51 Mustang pilot, and he had been shot down twice in World War II. And I jokingly said to him, everything happens in threes. You should have told me. I wouldn't have got on the plane with you. Such a nice man. My captain was back to flying. He had a concussion, but no lingering long-term effect. And my co-pilot, unfortunately, lost his career as a firefighter and a pilot. He does walk, but he walks with a cane. So his injuries were the most life-altering, if you will. He's a great guy. We're still buds, and it was very tough on him.
Yeah, and you guys have all been through an incredible experience together, which kind of bonds people.
It does.
Did they ever figure out what was the outcome as far as why did the brakes fail?
Well, so the NTSB did a thorough investigation, and they determined it was pilot error. This was only the third time that I had flown with this captain. He was a F-16 pilot. And F-16 pilots aerodynamically brake. And in this Learjet, now again, I told you this Learjet was not my company's. It actually belonged to another company. Just a side note, the Bin Laden family actually owned this aircraft at some point in history. Not Osama, but the other Bin Laden family here in the United States. And this company, I won't state who it was, and they were managing this aircraft. And so the captain worked for them. And Mr. Babs, who was a pilot, says, don't you remember when we touched down too light, and we actually came up and came back down. In a Learjet, you have to land with enough force that it enables what we call a squat switch. And then that would allow the brakes to deploy and the reverse thrusters. So because we landed light, and we didn't do a go around, There were no brakes. There was no reverse thrusters. That is what the NTSB's final decision was.
So even though it was considered pilot error, he was still able to get back and continue flying.
Right. And again, I don't blame anybody. I'm not a pilot, and I just know that I'm grateful that we're all alive.
I know you're a person of faith. Can you kind of just summarize what's your explanation of how you survived or why you survived, and maybe did it change your outlook on life at all?
Yes, I had accepted Jesus as my Savior as a young child, age 7, and walked with him and loved him and have been a disciple of Jesus for a long time. But I realized that I was a kind of person that was very much in control, and I prayed for God's strength and grace and stuff, but I did things in my own power a lot. And I just remember that I had tried everything in my own power to get up and get out of that aircraft. And it wasn't until I realized I could do nothing on my own. It was at that point that I realized the only thing I could do was cry out. And verses came to my mind where it says, "Cry to me in your day of trouble, and I will hear you and answer you and show you great and mighty things which you do not know." And God he has proven himself so faithful. He met all of our needs. He met our financial needs. He met our emotional needs. He proved to my children and to my family that he is a God of miracles, that he is still in the business of miracles, and that he keeps his promises to many generations, that he's a loving God. I remember so many times at night I would get these doubts, and I truly believe it was Satan whispering in my ear, like, you can't, you won't, this is the end of this. And I would just start fighting back with God's holy word. I would start quoting scriptures, and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And there's power in that. And so I realized that, I had walked this life of faith, but it was a very easy life. I had a blessed life. I had a charmed life, if you will. And it took this to make me realize that my faith is everything. I am nothing without my faith in Jesus, and that my faith is real, that he's there. And it just proved it beyond a shadow of doubt. And I don't take any day for granted. I try to take just joy in the small things. I love sitting out, my husband and I, in the morning and seeing the sunrise and having our quiet time of prayer and devotion together. And we've been blessed now with grandchildren, and just try not to take anything for granted. And I've been able to use this story to share into many people at many different occasions. And it always tends to give people hope. And I want that. I want that beyond anything. I want people to realize there is hope no matter what situation we are in. There is a God that loves us enough that he sent his son to come and die so that we could, through his precious blood, we could have a personal relationship with the God of creation. And that's, to me, that's what it's all about.
And there may be people listening to this who are going through a similar situation where they're having a hard time with therapy after an accident or injury. And so on the show notes for this episode, I'm going to put a link to that video that I mentioned so that people can kind of get an idea. It shows a depiction of a cartoon sort of depiction of the plane, how it crashed and went across the road and everything. Also talking about telling the story. But we'll also have your email address on the website. So if anyone wants to contact you, you're okay with them emailing you, right?
Absolutely. If I could encourage anybody, if I could come alongside and pray for anybody, if there's a group that would like me to come speak, I'd be more than happy to do that.
And you're right here in the Tampa Bay area where I am. We're not too far from each other.
Yes. Yeah. We are not.
All right. Well, Diana, I sure appreciate you coming on here. I'm glad you made it through, and what an awesome story. Thanks so much for telling us.
Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate you having me.
Diana, welcome back on the show.
Thank you, Scott. Great to be back.
Tell me, what has happened? You've had an interesting 5 years since you've been on the show. Your original episode was October of 2019.
Wow.
So it's actually been more than 5 years. And I know you've had a couple of pretty interesting things. Tell us about what happened with your granddaughter, Ivy.
Yeah, she's our youngest granddaughter. She's now 5, but when she was 2, they were living in Nashville, Tennessee, and she contracted RSV, which is respiratory syncytial virus, and it turned into a really bad pneumonia. It was called a necrotizing pneumonia, which actually ate through her lung. This was during COVID. She was rushed to Vanderbilt Hospital, and so only 2 adults could be with her. So my daughter and then myself, because of my critical care background, my son-in-law said, please, you have to be the other adult. Long story short, we were in there for 3 weeks with her. She underwent 4 surgeries. She had to have 4 different chest tubes put in. She went through septic shock. Just kind of along the lines of all the things that I had gone through post plane crash, this sweet little girl endured. And it was horrifying seeing her go through that. But God allowed me to be there as the grandma, but more as the critical care nurse to see trends and things that were happening and things that needed to happen and be her advocate. And she is thriving. And in all that, they decided that they wanted to move back to Florida to be closer to family, which we were so excited about. And so that little family, my daughter, son-in-law, and two granddaughters, Olive and Ivy, are actually living with us while they're building a house nearby. So it really all turned out for the good, but it was a very difficult time.
Wow. It's hard to think about how the future can be positive when you're right in the middle of all that, right?
Amen. Amen. Watching her suffer and not knowing for sure what the outcome.
Yeah.
It was difficult. It was difficult.
But it's got a happy ending, so that's good.
It does. God is so good, and she's precious. He's got her tapped for some great things, I am only sure.
Yeah, and you got to wonder, going through something like that at such a young age, well, she may not remember a lot of it, probably may not remember any of it, right?
Well, we talk about it every once in a while, because I definitely have post-traumatic stress from it. And, she'll remember certain things. She goes, that tube hurt. So she remembers the chest tube that was in her chest. And, she'll remember certain things about, she watched Bluey. That was like a distraction. So, but yeah, a lot of it she doesn't. And so for that, we're extremely grateful.
The other thing you told me about is you have kind of transitioned into a whole new career. How did that happen?
Yeah. So after the plane crash, I remember telling you all, I went back and finished my master's, and I was actually a professor teaching at the college I retired from. And, after I retired from that, there's a company that's called, ATI that actually, they come alongside nursing students while they're in college. And then at the end, we come along and we do a 3-day live review where, and a professor comes on campus, and for 3 days, we review all the important content they've gone through over the last few years before they get ready to take their big state board. And so anyway, I was hired to do that. And so we're doing some traveling with that. And I absolutely love it. It's like God has allowed me to take, being a professor, but then 40 years of critical care experience and melt it together and then go out and inspire and encourage. And I always share about my plane crash. And so I'm actually able to share about, what God did in my life. And it's always captivating to them. It's always, I always have students come up in tears and say, thank you for sharing that, and it encourages their faith. Maybe it stimulates them to think about their faith. Some don't have faith. Maybe it stimulates them to think like, what does she have I don't have? So that's been really exciting.
Yeah, you've got a unique story to tell.
Right. When you tell somebody, hey, I survived a plane crash, and then you show them the scars, they're usually captivated. They want to know more.
Hey, when your story was on the podcast, man, people loved it. And still, new people that discover the show look at past episodes, and yours is always one that they want to hear. Oh,
that's awesome. God definitely has used my pain for a purpose, and this is part of it. Yep.
You are, you're with a fire department now.
Right. So my husband retired 13 years ago from Pinellas Park Fire Department, and probably 5 years ago, just about, the chief came to us and said, "Hey, I have a question for you. I've really been thinking about this and praying about it. And would you two consider being chaplains?" And so we prayed about it and we said yes. And little did we know that the very next month, a firefighter that worked with my husband passed away, and we came alongside of his wife. Well, it entailed everything from writing the eulogy, presenting the eulogy, making the details for the funeral, etc. So we've done that about 4 or 5 times now for different firefighters and their family. And then we've had situations where, some firefighters have gone on calls that have been very difficult and doing some little, spiritual counseling after that. And then 2 years ago, one of the firefighters married to a beautiful ER nurse. They were getting ready to deliver their first son, and unfortunately he was born deceased, a perfectly formed little boy, 9 months old, and he did not make it through the birthing process. So that was really harrowing, very difficult to come alongside and try to just encourage them and love them and grieve with them. I'm happy to say that they did have another little girl, and she's doing well. But those are the kind of things that we've been able to come alongside folk and just try to love them and be real and just trying to assist and come alongside people in their times of need.
And you never know what situations you're going to be dealing with.
Not at all. Absolutely not.
Well, that makes it interesting anyway.
It really does. It really does.
It's one of the things I like about doing this podcast too, because, I never know what story is going to come into my inbox on any given day.
Exactly.
And, so that's, definitely not boring.
Absolutely not. Life is not boring, right?
All right. Well, Diana, I appreciate the update. I wish you continued success and have a great 2025.
Hey, thank you. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
In the episode notes, you can see pictures of the actual plane after the crash, as well as a more recent picture of Diana and her husband. That's at whatwasthatlike.com/203. As we start out this new year, I wanted to let you know about some of the types of stories I'm still looking for, in case you happen to know someone. I'm looking for someone who's not a pilot, but had to land a plane after the actual pilot had a problem. I'd like to talk with a non-firefighter who rescued a person from a burning building. I'm also looking for someone who won at least a few $1 million in the lottery more than a year ago. And I'd also like to talk with a former prison employee who was in charge of executions. And finally, the one I've been looking for since I started this podcast, someone who survived falling off a cruise ship while it was underway. So if you know anyone who has a story like those, or some other story that is crazy enough to fit in with my past episodes, have them contact me through the website, whatwasthatlike.com. Graphics for this episode were created by Bob Bretz. Full episode transcription was created by James Lai. And now we have the listener story. I love this segment. Every episode ends with a story that was sent in by a listener. And yes, we're still waiting on your story. Just record it on your phone and email it to scott@whatwasthatlike.com. This week's story needs a content warning. It involves a sexual assault during a massage. Stay safe, and I'll see you next week with another brand new episode.
My name is Jackie. I live here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I'm 41 years old, and this situation happened about 9 years ago. It was just a normal day. I was going for a massage and had never been to this clinic before. Thought I'd give it a try. It had just opened up. It was a massage chain where you do like subscriptions. And as someone who suffers from chronic pain, it's always been something that I have to do regularly, as I have quite a few flare-ups monthly. And this is just a way that I can deal with that treatment. So I got to the clinic, and the appointment was with a man. And I'm very open to that. I don't care as long as the therapist is good and they've got the right strength and can, work out the knots and kinks in my neck. That's all I really need. But I remember feeling very frustrated because the appointment was supposed to start, obviously, right on the hour, and he was running about 10, 15 minutes late. And as a new client and as somebody who is concerned about cutting into my treatment time, I was maybe a little bit spicy that it was a little unprofessional, but it's okay. I understand. I'm a very forgiving person. So, when he came out to apologize and start the appointment, I didn't think anything of it. So as I walked into the room, he had advised for me to get undressed, but lay on my back, which if you get massages often enough, you know that generally you'd start on your stomach, but that maybe it's because he's running late. So I did what he asked and I laid on my back. And shortly after the appointment started, I noticed that the sheet was beginning to get looser and looser up into the point where I thought, he can see my breasts. I was quite aware that I felt very exposed and felt that it was odd, but didn't think, again, much of it until he started to sort of make his way down my chest. And as that happened, I remember feeling kind of just like being frozen in time, being stunned, but then also questioning if I was overreacting. I had this moment of, this can't be happening, and I'm the one that's probably overthinking this. And then I adjusted the sheet, and he sort of maybe was aware that I kind of was on to what was happening. And then a little bit later, it started happening again. The appointment didn't last long because he had already been running late, and I was relieved. As I got dressed, and he came back into the room, he was very adamant that this wasn't his ideal situation and that I should come back the next day to the other clinic he works at for another massage. And he was very adamant that I come back. And I remember thinking, like, there's no way I'm ever coming back to see him or come back to this place again. So I think I made an excuse and just said, I'm sorry, I'm traveling. I wasn't being honest. I just wanted to get out of there. And as I left, he took his hand, tucked the tag into my dress, and then kind of grazed down my back. And I just thought, that is the weirdest, most intimate gesture. And that was so creepy. So I left and I went over to the coffee shop across the street. And I remember seeing 2 police officers and thinking, I should say something, but then thought, that's crazy. You can't just do that, I don't think. Why would I go up to these random police officers and catch them super off guard? And just honestly called my now husband, but fiance at the time, and told him what happened and went on with life, didn't think much of it. Maybe about 3 months later, I got an email from the clinic asking for a Google review. And I don't know on this particular day why I chose to do this, but I did write a review and I was just very honest about how uncomfortable the appointment made me and that I just thought it was really odd. Not even an hour later, I was getting a phone call from the owner of the clinic. And so her name was Rhonda, and she proceeded to tell me that that's not how they operate, that she was very upset to hear that I had this experience, but rest assured they would deal with it. But could I delete my review? And I remember feeling really hesitant and quite actually emboldened that someone would ask me to do that. But then I felt guilty and I started to feel like I don't want to hurt anyone's business. That's not my intention. Maybe I will delete it. She'd also offered me to come back with a different therapist, of course, for a complimentary massage. And I did. I accepted that appointment and it was fine. It was an okay experience. Massage was regular, standard, run-of-the-mill massage. And I did end up deleting that review, which is something now, looking back, I really quite regret. I have to say 2 years after that incident, at this point was married, life moved on. I saw an article on Facebook about a local man who was being charged with many different accounts of assault of women out of a massage clinic here in Calgary. And it was a gentleman named Greg, and he was the perpetrator and the person who had done my massage that day. I remember being shocked. I remember telling my husband, this is the same guy that massaged me that time, and just honestly stopping in my tracks around, I don't know what to do. Should I also report it? So I called the local police, and they were really helpful and very kind, and they asked me to come in to provide a statement, which I did. And they were so supportive. And at this point, the charges had already been filed. So there's not much my story could do unless there was additional charges. And my situation was one of the least severe. But they wanted to take my statement anyways, which I really appreciated. I felt very seen and very heard. But they told me that this was what he would do, that my situation is generally how it would start. They were actually surprised that he was so bold with the sheet and the massaging of my chest, that usually that happened a few appointments in. But nonetheless, the reason why he was trying to get me back was probably to take it a step further. Unfortunately, Greg was charged with these accounts, but his sentencing was only house arrest, which really bothered the police officers, and they were really frustrated with all the evidence because there were so many people that came forward, and wish I would have, had I known sooner or later. But he got house arrest, moved out of the city, lost his massage therapy license, his RMT, we call it here, and that was that. And unfortunately, the clinic did know of what was going on, and at the time that they had contacted me, he had been terminated. However, they were aware. And so what really frustrated me was the fact that they asked me to delete my Google review, knowing full well that what I was saying was true. And that really frustrated me that happened. And I think looking back, I think it's just one of those age-old scenarios to trust your gut. I felt uncomfortable in the situation. I should have said something immediately. I should have dealt with it immediately. And I really wish that I wouldn't have deleted that review, because maybe it could have helped somebody. But I am really glad that I came forward and still reported the incident. And, I'm just very upset that our justice system here in Calgary at the time gave him such a lenient sentence. I think he's a predator and will go on to try to do things like this in the future, because he is, obviously has a lot of issues, and hopefully he's gotten help or treatment for it. But with such a light sentence, I wouldn't be surprised if, he's a danger to society in the future. But that's my story. And hopefully it helps somebody, if you ever feel in the situation again. And thanks for listening.